Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the Steps to Sold podcast. Today, we are talking about concentration risks, the silent deal killers. Basically, how hidden dependencies in a business, whether it's customers, vendors, or key people, quietly erode away a value and scare off buyers when it's time to do a deal. My co-host, Christopher Sater, is here as well. Good morning, sir. How are you?
I am doing well, Brandon. How are you doing this morning, bud?
Oh, we're good, my man. It's almost a weekend. LSU's an underdog on the road at Vanderbilt, which I can't believe for the first time in 77 years. So 2025 really has been a weird one, to say the least. I am not putting my money on that game.
There's lack of faith there.
There is lack of faith. I believe, but I don't believe.
There you go.
That being said, we will see what happens this weekend. But back to the podcast, because I've let my frustrations out on LSU just now. Let's talk about concentration risk. Probably one of the most undervalued places that people look for problems in the business, and often owners tend to overlook because they get relaxed and don't look at it as an actual metric issue. Not the customer side with revenue, but often with the key employees and other topics we just mentioned in the intro. So let's put it like this. Your business is stable, been open 30 years, right? You're crushing it. You got, say, $5 million in revenue. Maybe one customer makes up 15, 20%. You start piecing yourself out. You got a great manager. You think you got a great business, right? $1 million EBITDA. Yeah, you should be able to just rock and roll, right? But this one key employee is 80% of your knowledge base. So yes, you don't have a customer concentration issue risk, but what do you have, Chris? You have a key employee concentration risk, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny how many times I start talking with a business owner who's interested in selling his business,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not even aware of these risks. I asked for what's your top 10 customer list and what's percentage of revenue. And then later down the road, we start talking about employees and how much one key employee,
Mm-hmm.
how much he does. The owner's absentee or semi-absentee, and this guy runs it all. That needs to be addressed. Let's put it that way. It's not a huge red flag at first. It can be addressed and monitored, and
Mm-hmm.
there's ways to work it into the deal, but it definitely is not something you can start down the road with, put it on the market, and then buyers are the first ones to kind of notify the seller that, hey, you've got this going on in your business. The broker needs to address it and make sure it's noted.
No, you're correct. It's funny because concentrations can show up, not always on paper, like we said, but they can also appear slowly over time without you realizing it as an owner. You don't always tend to think about that. You know, let's identify the main spots. First, revenue is the obvious one. Everybody thinks about revenue. Do you have one customer that buys all your stuff? People often forget about, supply vendors, the supply chain, like where are your materials coming from? Are you dependent on suppliers from China, whether it's raw materials, finished products, whatever? We saw this year with Trump's tariffs, how that changed a lot of landscaping. It's made manufacturing people in businesses in the United States a lot more valuable, but sometimes they still can't get the raw products in, right? Or if a government shutdown, slowing down checkpoints and ports and entry, that can be a barrier issue too. Besides that, you have knowledge skills and leadership, and key employees or key owners or key managers. It's great to have them. We always stress you need them, which is true. But if that one person, say you have 20 employees, but that one person is everything and the rest are just technicians or field hands that kind of roam around, that can also be a bit of an issue because that person now is integral into the business selling. You can't always control people. Yeah, you can do employment agreements, but you and I know humans are humans, and they will make decisions they think are in their best interest or just decide to do what they want to do. So whether it's a private individual, a private equity, a family office, strategic buyer, those are often some of the quick issues they're going to want. We talk about this all the time when we get these buyer inquiries. Hey, what's the EBITDA? Hey, what's the SDE? What's the revenue? What concentration issues? Boom. That's like surprisingly becoming more and more common, a top 3 or 4 question, correct? I feel like that's really gotten to be a bigger issue, especially with online now and retail sales and other sales differentiating. Used to be geographically you were isolated, you relied on your community. But now if you're supplying stuff all around the world, we've seen certain clients of ours and businesses start unnaturally and not realizing it, supplying just one area too strong. They don't look at it. They look at the bottom line, which is great, but they don't realize I'm becoming way too dependent on buyer A or buyer B that really that I have has no loyalty to me, because if the prices of my product are cheaper somewhere else online, they'll start buying it there, right? We've seen that
Yeah,
before with a lot of businesses.
and you know who comes in right behind buyers that's concerned about all this concentration? The lenders. I've had a
Yes,
lot of lenders start to kind of follow this
push deals
trail.
off.
Yeah, if you got a client, what's the percentage? Probably 15-20%. You start hitting that range with one customer, percent
Questions
of
come up.
revenue. Yeah. Lately I've had here on a recent deal, I had a vendor concentration issue. Everything was coming from one or two vendors. Little concerned there from the lender. They asked for some more information on that. Luckily, there's 4 or 5 other vendors that they could go to if needed. So if these one or two vendors shut down or something, the relationship sours
Mhm.
after the sale happens, it's not going to kill the deal. So, but we had to address it, right? And so, yeah, lenders are just as important as buyers. They are looking at everything. They want to know before they put their money out there and put their risk tolerance out there that they're covered as well with all these concentrations.
You're not wrong. You made a good point talking about kind of the benchmarks of concern. You still looking at 15, it's like a mild red flag, maybe a rose color. It's not a concern, but we need to make sure we really, do our diligence on this particular customer, how long, and if they're buying just one product or multiple products, or there's integration in different areas. You start getting over 20 to 25%, you're going to have a serious red flag. And if you get to 50, you, I'll never say it's not sellable, but your multiple and the contingencies and the legalities of the final APA are going to be a lot stricter and harder to swallow as a seller, take a bite of, because it's going to be tough. The buyer's going to want serious protection, and rightfully so. When you're looking at that heavy a customer concentration, there are going to be issues, and there's a lot of risk. And if you're leveraging two, three, four, five, six, $10 million, whatever it is, you're relying on the cash flow and the debt service to pay off that business, right? And if 50% of your revenue disappears in one day, that you're done. You you are.
And I
And
think
that's
as
where
our job as brokers is we come in and we advise our clients, our business owners of these concentrations that maybe they weren't even aware of, or they're aware of them, but they didn't know they were something that needed to be noted. And our job
Mhm.
is not to scare them. We're not trying to scare our
No.
sellers, but it's to prepare them. Because once you identify all these risks and you've identified them early, they are absolutely not deal breakers. There is no deal that can't be done. You could have 100%
Mhm.
revenue coming from one customer. You still can sell your business, but it has to be identified early, and it won't be a deal breaker, but it's got to be a deal shaper. It exactly like you said, the multiples got to change because you've got to
Mhm.
address for this risk. That's what we do as brokers is we're assigning value based on the risk tolerance of buyers coming into the deal.
You're correct. And let's make a distinction too here that we didn't touch on with revenue. There's two types of revenue. There's regular sales and there's also contractual revenue. And yes, it's good to have a lot of contractual revenue secured. It's okay when it's still a customer concentration issue. That will help mitigate some of, like you just said, we have to offset the multiple a little bit because it's contractual, it's obligated. But now that means you probably have to do a stock sale. You can't do an asset sale in some cases because of that. So that can also limit what your deal structure can look like too, and how you would also fund that deal. I would tell somebody it's much better if you have a customer concentration that is contractual and it's a little bit diversified in that contract than just a regular sale. We've had several custom deals like that over the years where, the owner, the revenue was 20% for one client. Oh, they just always bought from us for 20 years. They don't go to anybody else. And the buyer said, I understand that. But as the internet has expanded reach, there are people now in your space offering that online. I'm worried about buying your company because if you're not there, Mr. Owner, and you don't have a key man, how do I know these people aren't going to go to somebody else and buy this product? Right? How do I know I have some kind of protection? And you're not willing to give me any seller financing. That owner wouldn't give any detail, any kind of structure to that in a deal. And the buyer walks. I can't do it. I need something. I need something to give me some kind of protection. Doesn't mean I'm not willing to sign a personal guarantee on the note. Didn't mean I wasn't willing to restructure the price or work on some kind of terms. But that's too big a chunk. It just is. And I don't blame that buyer. It was a very tough situation to have to tell the owner. We identified it, we disclosed it. He said he understood it. When it came time to the deal, that owner wouldn't budge. And ironically, that client left about 4 months later and that listing tanked. It tanked because it went from being pretty profitable to just barely breaking even. And it I know 20% shouldn't do that, but it was the most consistent and, let's say net 30 customer. They got paid quick. And when that person disappeared, he had to let off some workers. He let off some workers. Some other workers got scared. And you know how that spiral can occur because we've seen that before where a business takes a big hit and it goes from trending upwards to making that quick drop. And as owners, it's okay if you have customer concentrations. Work on diversifying them if you can. Correct, Chris?
Yeah, and I would say from a valuation standpoint of your business, I wanted to hit you with this and get your thoughts on
Mm-hmm.
it as well. Let's use a nice round number, $1 million SDE, $1 million in profit. But you got huge customer concentration. Maybe you got 4 or 5 customers that are just a big chunk of business. If
Mm-hmm.
the seller is willing to do the earnout with saying, that these customers are going to stick around and the earnout's based on them sticking around for a buyer, are you able to get a higher multiple as long as the seller is willing to work with that? Or if they're not, does that lower the multiple and you put that in your marketing that, hey, we've got, top 5 customers are 80% of revenue, but that's why we're asking a 3X instead of a fix? Maybe I'm not sure. Even as a broker, I battle that today because a lot of owners, like I said, they're not even aware that they've got a customer concentration. They don't understand that as a risk in their business until we kind of advise them of that. And then second of all, they're not willing to do an earnout because they don't know the buyer coming along. So it's really kind of a toss up of how you approach that as a broker. What are your thoughts?
Excellent question. I would say typically, as you know, we don't do quote unquote the true definition of an earnout. Typically, in this case, it's more of a customer retention over a period of time. Thus, that purchase price will be paid up. And normally, it's just still a good amount down up front. This isn't like, hey, we're going to take just 20% of cash and you got to earn out the rest of the 80%. So people that are out there listening know. I think as long as it's contractual and the owner is wanting to sell for a much longer treadway, I think you can still get closer to multiple that it's worth, especially if the owner's willing to concede on those two areas. If the owner either wants a shorter exit or wants more money up front, like a large portion, let's say 80 or 90%, I think then you have to shrink the multiple. But if the owner wants to get top premium dollar and is willing to change his flexibility of leaving the company and making some improvements, maybe even pre-sale, I think then you can ask that multiple. But it has to be a very clear understanding. And I think the house has to be annotated in the sim like, hey, I see a lot of places now in the sim on the back side of it say, here are terms we expect in an LOI, and here's what we're willing to offer too. That tells a buyer very early on, like, hey, we're going to do cash free, debt free style deal. I will stay on for at least 2 years. I will make sure that XYZ transitions. When you would tell a buyer up front, I identified the red flags and I'm willing to
Mhm.
work past them,
Yep.
that's when I think you can ask a better multiple. But if you're just throwing it out there and kind of hoping the wind catches the sails, that's when you got to say, no, that's not going to work. You advise somebody. And if you really want to be done, or in some cases, we've had owners that have health issues. We've seen this happen before where they are a major part of the business and the health issue comes up, customer concentration issues. You have to sell for a lower multiple because your timeline is short and your ability to stay around is going to be short. So you have to concede that because no buyer is going to pay a premium knowing the obvious other risks are there to be had. We've got a business right now that's a great example of how it's set up revenue wise. It's killing it, almost, say $2.5 million a year in revenue. It's got a profit margin of 50%, industrial manufacturing. Owner comes in twice a week, maybe a little more to pay bills and check in. Very limited employee staff, one key person, one key salesman. On paper, this is a 4 to 5 multiple easy, especially now with tariffs in this country. But the only real red flag is there is a key employee who has a little bit of equity ownership that runs day to day. So this business is really one key person away from being extremely profitable or being just subpar. And that's a red flag. It's not, most good buyers understand that and say, look, if we buy this, we have to have this guy on board. Whether they retain equity, give him more equity, that deal structure, that can be worked out. But like you're respond again to your proposed question, owners have to come in with a playbook of flexibility. Understand that just because you got a certain price is not a reflection of it being bad or good. It's a reflection of what risk tolerance and transferability, as we always say, a buyer can handle.
Yeah, I always find as a broker, I'm trying to highlight, not highlight, that's the wrong word, address the red flags. And I want to put it in the
Mm-hmm.
marketing because what's in the marketing is the asking price, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you've got an asking price in your marketing materials, if you're going that route, which I always do, and I think you always do as well, we're not the kind that go out there with no asking price, and we know Buyers don't.
No, I think that's just we can address that in another podcast.
But
Great
yeah, that's
idea.
a whole
Next
nother
podcast,
podcast.
tune in for that. We're going to
Yeah,
hit
yeah.
that hard.
Businesses with no asking price. What's your thoughts? No, but if you put the asking price and you don't put all the red flags, let's call them, then the buyer comes in and they find the red flags and they think, oh, well, he didn't even know those because it's not in the sim. We didn't even talk about it up front. So now I'm going to take this $5 million asking price and ping it. No, that's I think as a broker, it's our job to
Hmm.
say, this is the asking price. Here's the story of the business. And here's, let's call it warts. We want to put them in the best light. And
Hmm.
all businesses have warts. So it doesn't really matter,
Yes.
but you put that in front with or right behind the asking price so that you're the one saying this is we're already aware of this and this is still our asking price, not the other way around of telling them later and letting them find them on their own.
Yes. No buyer wants to be deceived. And that's how it comes across sometimes.
Yeah.
And there are times that we will get information that's incorrect from a seller. It has happened.
What?
But I know, right? But our goal is in a good broker and a good owner have complete transparency. We're going to keep saying the word transparency out there for those of you listening because this is probably the best word in our vocabulary for what we're trying to help people understand. When there is transparency, there is transferability. And buyers are going to look. And I say this to owners out there too, especially strategic buyers. On Main Street level deals, customer concentration is an issue, but typically the business is smaller, it's not that big a threat. You start getting to the lower middle market and strategic acquisitions. Customer concentration is almost one of the the second, about the most important issue, right behind, I would say, the total flatline EBITDA or SDE / owner involvement. Those two I kind of combine
Let's
together.
talk about, we talked a lot about customer concentration and revenue concentration.
Mm-hmm.
I've run into several of my deals vendor concentration and supply risks.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to find later. You start working with a client as a broker, and obviously you talk about revenue, top 10 like that, but later in the deal, you find out, later in the progress of working with a client, you find out they're working with one or two vendors. Have you come into
Mm-hmm.
have you found that before with clients, and kind of what was your way to address that?
Great question. So we had one recently that ended up not listing or is still thinking about it, I guess is a better way to say it. He was a preferred distributor for a manufacturing group that specializes in certain kind of equipment here in South Louisiana. He's the only guy. So he's got the niche in that respect, which gives him typically a multiple boost. The problem is he's the only person that these vendors sell to, and he then goes out and also handles and manages repairs and installation and distributing the manufacturing products. So you have a concentration risk on his end with the owner's knowledge, but also with the vendor. Let's say one of those two companies gets bought out by a competitor that he gets parts from, or maybe one of those two companies goes out of business. Well, if he can't supply the machinery and the parts to repair what he's got out in the field, his customer base is going to go somewhere else, right? So you have to weigh that owner concentration issue, but also which a bigger thing is the vendor issue. If only two vendors supply these machines and one of them goes out, that's going to be very difficult to get supplies and to say, hey, I can get the parts to fix the equipment that I sold you. So how do you weigh it? And you have to tell the owner, unfortunately, it's going to put a hamper on how far we can extend your multiple. Yes, you have great cash flow. Yes, you have market dominance, but you are unfortunately one phone call away from, hey, so and so manufacturing got bought out by XYZ manufacturing, and they got their own reps, right? Or they've got their own people that do this, and they're going to go nationwide, or they don't want y'all anymore. They want to sell direct. They don't want to have a middleman handle it. They want to do their own field work. Like that does happen, and you have to weigh it. Now, how much do you weigh? That's always the biggest pushback I get from owners is, well, how did you come to up to this weight? Well, there's no one definition anywhere as a resource to find that, right, Chris? We have a lot of great comps, a lot of great ways to pull information from different deals to put together to give our analysis. At the end of the day, it's also you have to trust our judgment. And I'm not asking for blind trust. I'm asking for you to say, look at what we present you as far as the analytics, what we've seen other deals go for, what is realistic, what's best case, worst case, where you fall, and then say, well, you're using our weighted judgment. Here's where I say AI still cannot do what we do. I've been doing this for 13 years. My father did it for 25 years. Our combined group's experience is over 100 plus years. We're putting our experience in watching over 850 deals that we've done be put together and say, yes, here's my professional opinion. I understand it's still a subjective number. but I'm putting that number out there to you based on what I see offers going for, what I've seen deals completed, and what makes business sense to me. You don't have to agree with it. You may not like it, you may love it. I understand that. But I always tell owners when I'm weighing this, I put myself in the buyer's shoes. What makes sense for the risk? Yes, we want to get the best price for the owner. Yes, we want to get the best deal because someone is looking to that money as their retirement fund, or just you want to get the best deal which you can for your product. Everyone does, whether it's your house, selling your car, whatever. But sometimes there aren't metrically perfect numbers to put on something, and we can't always quantify it. So we do our best to use our business judgment. And that's why you should use a good advisor or good broker who has experience. That's where that experience parlayed with our resources and our comps allows to give you the best option. And I know that's not a great answer, Chris, but that's really all you can do sometimes is take your own subjective opinion, take the data you have, and give a verified, educated guess.
Yeah. No,
There's not always an easy playbook.
absolutely. And let's talk about what the fix is for business owners who may have a vendor concentration risk. What are buyers worried about? First of all, they're worried about that they buy the business and that supplier is either going to
Transferability.
raise prices, maybe even. So now margins are cut way down, or they're going to exit the market, or they're going to stop selling to you altogether because of whatever reasons. The fix is not to cut ties with that vendor. That's not what we're telling you to do. The
No.
fix is to build backup options. Start working with small other vendors, or at least have them as options, even if you're not going to do business with them. But have those
Have
ready.
market research
I would
ready.
go ahead and test the market. Maybe it doesn't make your number one
Mm-hmm.
vendor a little unhappy if they find out about it. But if you're getting ready to sell your business in the next 2 to 3 years, you've got to make sure that you can order from more than just one or two places, because buyers are going to want to know that.
Or if you can't find other options, look to get contractual agreements in place to control costs and control changes or spikes that could be in your industry.
Great point.
We saw a lot of that recently when you helped sell a lumber yard a couple of years ago when the housing costs, the housing costs and also supplies went up, very rapidly. And luckily, if you have a good relationship with vendors, you can get, hopefully lock in some kind of protection on those costs where you're not having to go buy as needed and having to absorb that big 20, 30, 40% bump, right? Where, hey, I can get these products consistently. That's not always an option, but it's also another way, like you said, to mitigate those issues. And as an owner, you always have to be worried about the next step. And I think often too many owners, these concentrations occur because they got comfortable. And we understand that. The business funds a lifestyle for a lot of owners. And once you get that lifestyle goal, as long as you're making the same money and things are good and you're not having any real issues, you don't worry about it. The problem is the day you call us and say, hey, I'm ready to sell. It's like, okay, well, had we talked maybe a year before, we could have started to kind of identify some of these pieces on the chessboard and say, let's just kind of move things around, right? Let's focus on some strategy here where maybe it's not all done in time. Maybe you can't make a ton of direct changes, but the little effort you make can make a big difference when it comes time, as we always say, to that transferability of that business, right? And that's where you can't always just check the box and fix the issue for those of you listening, but you can mitigate it. And if you're taking steps to mitigate it, that improves buyer confidence. When buyer confidence is higher, your multiple can be higher. So it's not an apples to apples answer, but it is a process you can start to increase your odds of getting there. And as a buyer, you want this to happen. You should be willing to pay for that, because if you go out and do a lot of deal searching, which if you're a real buyer and you're going to do that, you're going to see the real red flags and go, the one I passed on really wasn't that bad. How often do we see that, Chris, where customers come in and say, well, I just can't believe you have a customer concentration of 20%. I would never buy that business. Have you seen the rest of the market sometimes? There are far worse cases out there. And as a buyer, you have to realize what's on the market is what's on the market. That's what you're able to pick from. This is not the grocery store where you can go down the street from Rouse's to Albertsons to Walmart to find something else. Sometimes your local market, that's what's available. So you have to be able to willing and absorb that risk and understand it. Granted, you design your LOI and your offer to reflect that, but it's not going to change what's out there. And I want buyers listening to understand that as well. It doesn't mean the seller gets whatever they want. It doesn't mean you get whatever you want. It means you'll have to find a common marriage of ideas that make sense for a deal to go through. And then on top of that, if financing is involved, as you said earlier, Chris, you got to consider the lender's tolerance, not just SBA requirements, but the lender's own individual quantitative measures they're going to want to see done to protect their investment. All parties got to feel good about it.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. How many times that you go talking to business owners out of 10 how many of those 10 have some type of concentration issue, whether it's revenue, customer, vendor, knowledge? I mean, it's not uncommon, I don't think. I run into it more often times than not, I think. Probably at least four or five times, whether it's, it may be only be that 15% revenue, but I find that pretty often because like you always say, usually the top 10%, 10 of top 10 customers are 80% of your revenue or something like that. And small businesses that don't have a large customer base, I'll tell you one right now.
Mhm.
I've got a freight broker. He's got maybe 30, 40 active customers. Top customer is
Mhm.
60% of revenue. Yeah, we identified it early. We addressed it. It was valued for. Luckily, we've got a great LOI in place that it kind of it's we don't have to do any type of earn out or anything like that. The customer doesn't have
Mhm.
to stick around. Lenders signed off on it. Of course, we've got a great government shutdown right now, so SBA is not able
That we do.
SBA is not able to get the deal done until we get that resolved. But yeah, how many times out of 10 do you see
Mhm.
this? Is it common or uncommon for you, would you say, to have concentrations?
I think it's a two-tier question, and I'll take it in two approaches: Main Street versus lower middle market, because I think the answer is very different for both. For Main Street businesses, probably 5 out of 10 there's some kind of concentration issue, whether it's customer or key employee. Not as much vendor at the Main Street level because they're not big enough to have buying from a massive supplier. Often it's either a concentration mostly of the owner's knowledge or key employee, where that owner is the business, like the one I was just referencing, or it is a customer issue where, you know, not as much in like the trades like HVAC and electrical and all that, but you see that more of like, let's say, smaller distribution or smaller manufacturing where regionally you're capped by your presence. And you've got maybe one or two, like here in Louisiana, we have a lot of industrial up and down the river that services these plants. We've had a lot of guys where their customer was 30-40% was Exxon, or 30-40% was X plant, or 30-40% was just one group. That's the main issue we face. More often than not, 50% of the time, there's some kind of concentration. Not always bad or deal
Yeah,
wrecking, but something you have to reconcile
that's right.
for. When you go to the lower middle market, that's often probably 30 to 40% of the time at most. And typically that's because either A, the company is not scaled enough where the owner's fully out, but still has a key knowledge base, or B, they got one customer early on when they were a growing company from that million to maybe 10 million revenue range. And that person's been with them for 20 years. You know this story. Great relationship. Owner knows the owner of the other company. They've been reliable. They trust them emphatically. No contract in place because they've always done business together. Correct. But at some point, both parties know each other are going to leave and exit their businesses. So you need to identify those early. It's easier in the lower middle market space to get around because there's more revenue and more cash flow on the books to offset that risk, but also get financing. There's more of a fallback, right? There's more of a parachute behind them. Whereas with the smaller deals, as you and I both know, the multiples are smaller because not just the cash flow is smaller, but because it's the knowledge base of the owner typically is the business and is more concentrated. So that's where it becomes a bigger issue in most cases. It is different both sides of the market, and that's an excellent question because often I hate to break it out like that, but when you're looking at different size businesses, you have to consider that, and that's where when people with too much experience coming in strategically from M&A world want to buy Main Street level, you can't treat it like an M&A deal. It's a different type of deal and different type of transferability. You have to accept that going in, or you're never going to get a deal done. And same from a lower, let's say a Main Street buyer looking to buy a lower middle market deal. It's just
Yeah.
different.
And
But great
I
question.
think a lot of times when a business grows, they hit that $10 million revenue mark. They realize somewhere along the way that they needed to diversify everything to
Mm-hmm.
protect what they're building here. We can't have this one vendor. We can't have just a handful of customers. We got to branch out and we got to
Mm-hmm.
make sure that if customer number 1 or customer number 2 drops off this year, we're not going to go under because we can't foot our
Mm-hmm.
bills. So I think that's part of it. Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's go back and talk about knowledge concentration. You talked about that with a business
Yes.
you're looking at now. I don't get that a whole lot in my deals. One or two, we may have a key man, number one, but what have you seen as far as really? Yeah, you mentioned one earlier, but do you get that a lot as far as knowledge concentration on deals?
Not as much as you would think. And maybe I overstated that much. I'm not trying to generalize it. You see it more so in the trade areas where the owner is the license. We talked about that in other episodes where that's more of an issue. The other time it's been an issue is we see it kind of that flex, like upper level of Main Street, lower level of lower middle market, that kind of $3 to $6 million acquisition size. Because typically that owner has been there and built that business, and he was the driving forces to why it's made that big jump, right? It's almost reached his scale of management or his ability to, he's capitalized to make that jump. He's got a very specific set of knowledge. You don't worry about it, and they may have a key employee they've transferred a lot of it to. But if that business relies on one or two people who have that really specific skill set, that kind of is the integral part of why people trust a company. Not that other employees can't do a good job, but they know, hey, so and so at business X, he knows how to get it done. And that's why I call him. That's when you start saying, I see that more and more with these trades and these manufacturing business that we're starting to get a lot more interest in that are coming to market. The owner is in this, like the one I mentioned before previously, that was pretty strong. Barely 10% customer concentration, manufacturing parts. He comes in, like I said, 1 to 2 times a month. The next level person down that has equity is the key guy, as is the salesman. And if you're buying that company, yes, that company has the machinery. It's got all the parts and bells and whistles to continue on just fine. The customers aren't going anywhere because they are the only guy in the region. It's an excellent business. But what happens when that buyer buys that business and the one day one of the customers comes in and says, hey, I need to fix it, and he's gone. And then you can't do it. Well, that buyer is going to say, that customer is going to say, I got to look elsewhere. I need to start considering that. Like we said, people do watch for that. And that's where we see it as, hey, it's not a problem. We just need to highlight it, like you said earlier, and address it. We do see it coming in more and more to the market, but I think more people are realizing they need to diversify themselves and train other people. You need to, as an owner, I'll say this, you need to empower your people to make good decisions and diversify your skill set. I think one thing I'm going to pat myself on the back here for, my dad always said when I was in here before he passed away, you've got to learn everything about the business up and down, and I've got to transfer that to you. And he did a good job of that. I know I didn't get everything from him, but if I got 90% of what he learned over 25 years, I can learn the other 10% and I can pass that down. But I've also relayed that into other people who help with Ryan in our office and Gary and other people and like yourself. I share that knowledge because the more I diversify my knowledge to y'all, the safer the organization is if I ever get sick or something happens to me. But also the fact that everybody else can do the same job as me. And that's important. That we're not, Brandon's the main guy to bring it for this size deal only, that our team can handle it. I think you understand that well too. It's about transferring that base down.
Yeah. And I think the way to handle that as a business owner or when you're selling your company, and for me as a broker, I advise my clients that, hey, you own all the knowledge. So in the deals where I have been, and that's been an issue or something to address, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
you may need to stick around for 6 months or a year. This is not going to be sell your business, you work for 30 days and you're out. The amount of knowledge you have or the number two guy has, and that's where we can really talk is the number two guy and how to protect that. Because, yeah, as the
Mm-hmm.
owner, you can sign a contract, you're going to sign a purchase agreement, and you can kind of put a money in escrow to say it doesn't even have to be an earnout, but you need to stick around for a year so I can make sure I get all your knowledge. When that number two guy is the guy, you can't really lock him down. You can get an employment agreement, but based on Louisiana,
Humans are
yeah, I don't
humans.
wanna go into law, but we're an at what do you call it? Right to work state, something like that. So, if they wanna quit day 2 and ignore the employment agreement that you signed, they can. So that's that always gives buyers pause for concern when they're buying a business and even if they're getting agreements and contracts. Usually what I say in that or what we've done I know in the past is the buyer's gotta meet that number 2 guy. They've gotta form some kind of relationship before the deal is
At a
consummated.
certain
Yeah,
stage.
at a certain stage, right. Much later in the process, financing has been secured, guaranteed, purchase agreements are being written, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's ways to mitigate this knowledge concentration. But again, we go back to transparency. I love that word that you said earlier, and just kind of making sure that the deal is structured in a way that everybody's going to feel comfortable. Everybody knows going in, this is
Mm-hmm.
what we're working towards.
You're right. And for owners out there listening, we've talked about this prior, but that's a good point to bring this back into the conversation. If there is a employee or knowledge concentration, getting that knowledge onto paper, into manuals, into documents that can be handed off to speed up the transition, to make your transition and transferability better. That's a way to mitigate it. You can't take 20 years of experience and put it on paper and hope someone can just absorb it. We're not advocating for that. What we're advocating for is you take, if that takes 10% out of your head, puts it on paper for that buyer. I guarantee you that savvy buyer who is buying your company, he's going to read that book every single night. He's going to read that manual and know it front and back. My father always taught us, you've got a contract or a document in your office, you better be able to quote it verbatim when someone calls you on it. You should not have to go look it up, quote it. The same goes for anybody buying a company. So anything of knowledge that you feel like needs to be, on retention, on call, on snap, get that down on paper or get it to somebody else as well as on paper. That way, the number two also can't hold your deal hostage. Most number two guys are really good people. Let's state that. They want to be involved, they want to be there. But there are some humans who will take advantage of a situation and try and hold something up. Even if they don't do it pre-deal, post-deal. That has happened. And that's why buyers and lenders get scared, right? That's why they say that they have that key employee document to sign with the SBA loan. We've dealt with that, correct? On several deals me and you have done together. It does matter. And we're not painting a doom and gloom picture here. What we're painting is the reality and pragmatic points of a deal you have to consider. We're the anti-guru where everything's just perfect and easy. No, you have to weigh these human elements. And if you're smart, you weigh them while you start your initial conversations and prepare that in your initial LOI, IOI, or offer. Because if you identify that, your ability to then capture that information, execute on that information, and succeed with that information goes up. And what do people want to see? We're going to say the word again, transferability. That's what matters. That's why we're talking about concentration risk today. Metrically, subjectively, knowledge base, whatever. It's important to think about it a little differently when structuring your deal, especially the larger the deal gets and the more avenues that could occur. So we've talked about the vendors. We've talked about the knowledge. We've talked about the revenue, right, Chris? We've kind of gone over the main ones that people talk about all the time. Let's talk about lending a little more. We broached it a couple different times throughout the episode about what lending and how it affects it. But let's talk about really what the lenders are going to want. As we all know, SBA wants 10% equity injection, right? That's when you say, right, Christopher. I was trying to give you a freebie there.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. No. So they want 10%. But every key SBA lender is going to want to know next thing, cash flow and key employees. Because once the lender knows that key employee is identified, we just mentioned the form, they're going to want to identify how important is that role. And is that role involving licensing? Is that role involving technical knowledge? Or is it just an operations guy that just manages the fleet of people going out doing the lawn care or going to clean windows, whatever it may be? They're going to underwrite that in their underwriting specifically and annotate how important that person is. They're going to look at that person's salary. And for a lot of brokers out there, they say, well, you can do all this on your own. You can cut these managers' salaries. You can cut all that. No. Managers are important to the business. And if the broker out there is telling you to cut these manager salaries and cut their health insurance and cut their employee benefits to offset the concentration risk, run away. I think you and I talked about a deal you saw recently where somebody tried to add all that back in. And that doesn't absorb the risk issue. That actually increases the risk issue.
Right. Yeah, they were trying to add to the cash flow by saying they had 4 or 5 extra employees that they just were loyal to and couldn't cut, but they were expecting a buyer to come in day one and cut those things, and they wanted it didn't even add up. It was like $700,000 of cash flow back to the bottom
Mm-hmm.
line. And it just that's not a good way to set up a deal, is to say, buyer, you're going to come in, because at some point you got to involve the lending institution, right? So you're going to go to this lending institution and say, first thing I'm going to do is cut out these 4 or 5 employees they think are over the top, and what faith is that going to give to the rest of the employees that they're not going to be cut at some point? I love hearing the deals that come in where a buyer's coming in and he says, I'm not going to change anything for 6 months. Absolutely nothing. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not even going to implement my plan for 6 months. I need to see the way this thing works, and kind of then I'll start making some calls.
Assessing
Yeah,
talent.
exactly. So yeah, that's not the way to enter a deal, right?
Yeah, because we had a restaurant similar, absentee owner contacted us, I guess you would say there is a knowledge concentration there in the sense that, I got this extra staff handling everything. It's making a lot of gross sales, not really profitable. If you cut this and you cut this and you cut this, I'm like, but if someone coming has to cut the GM day one, and obviously the restaurant's making a lot of money in revenue and sales and the food costs are way under control, you come in and cut who's been the leader of the team because the current owner's absentee to offset that, you're going to have a morale issue. I'm sorry. That's not like you just said, that's not the way to do business, in my opinion. That's where as buyers and you get to evaluate and look at this thing and say, is this deal the right fit for me? If I have to make all these dramatic changes to make this deal work, I probably shouldn't do it. And that's where as an owner, you have to be willing to say, yeah, I'm between a rock and a hard place sometimes, and I better be flexible and be willing to work this out. But adding that back is not a way to solve the issue. And I see too many times there's a concentration issue. Brokers try to rework this cash flow magic, as we call it, right? Where they start kind of playing with this stuff. Yeah, but that's not an issue because you can cut this and you can move this around. If it was that easy, why didn't the current owner do it? It's true.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
I think we should highlight a deal you've done recently, talking, of concentration issues and, with lending and with buyer confidence. This time the lending didn't really be necessary, but let's talk about the deal you did for $13 million. How much concentration were the top three customers?
Yeah, I think top three were 88% of revenue. And the way we mitigated that is it was early on. The buyer said, "Hey, at some point we're going to need to talk to all three of those customers." And they didn't just have a phone
That's right.
call. This was flying to West Texas, South Texas, wherever they needed to go to meet these three
Hmm.
customers. It was a sit down, it was a dinner. No contracts weren't signed because they didn't even have a contract before. It was, they had an agreement on paper of work to be done, but
But again, that's why a buyer is like, hey, we have to do
well,
this. I really can't
yeah,
feel confident moving forward till I at least get a green light from somebody with authority.
and at the end of the day, buyers, even lenders, especially SBA back lenders, they can decline
Hmm.
funding or to move forward if customer concentration is driving too much revenue. But I will say this, numbers alone don't decide value. They don't decide what's going to happen. What does? It's confidence. It's confidence in
Hmm.
what's happening now with the business is going to continue forward. So as a business owner and a seller, if you can show recurring contracts, retention rates, let's talk about that. Retaining employees, how long they stay on board. What backup plans? What do you have for backup plans for vendors? You will give the
Hmm.
buyers what they need most, which is that confidence. You're giving them reassurance that your income
Hmm.
stream won't vanish the day they take over. That's what they're looking for. That's their biggest concern. All buyers are concerned the day I
Hmm.
take over, all the employees going to quit. Have you heard that one before? I'm seriously. They really
Yes.
think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
These employees need a job and they work there for a reason. Yeah, you might lose one or two over time. That's like you said, human nature. But if you can show all this stuff, you can set yourself up for success to show that the income stream is not going to vanish, or at least heavily decline the day a buyer takes over. You're giving them confidence and you're mitigating all these concentrations that we're talking about today.
You're correct. And it's not always easy to do, but we stress to owners, you have to look in the mirror and be very sure what you're giving us and sure in yourself. Because if you're not sure in the product, the buyer is not going to be sure in it. And I think often owners, especially in lower middle market deals, a Q of E is going to happen. They don't know what the Q of E is. And we've talked about what the quality of earnings report is and how important it is to understanding cash flow. Where it comes important here is identifying customer base. Often the QV make sure you've got stable cash flow. The accounts are allocated in the proper years and months and timelines. What does the QV also do, Chris? It looks at where the customers are coming from and identify those concentrations. So it's important as a buyer, if you think there might be an issue like that, get the Q of E done and identify that and get it metrically controlled. Sometimes an owner's POS system does not properly allocate where everything's coming from. It may have 25 different itemized products they service, but you may not realize that company A is buying 10 of those services for 20% of the revenue. Yes, it's diversified into 10 different subcategories, but can you take it the next level back on the flow chart and say, oh, yeah, that was a company using multiple different parts of our service. We never realized they made up that big a concentration of the cash flow coming in. So, as a buyer, if you think there may be that issue or you're not sure, get the Q of E done. That will also be able to kind of double check the owner's representations too. Make sure that it lines up appropriately and that's properly being accounted for. I see some companies we've dealt with, they have a big vendor they use or a big customer that comes in, buys a bunch of different types of items. They just send one big invoice or they send 4,000 tiny invoices and you don't know where they're all coming back at what time and they're being paid correctly from that same customer. So you don't realize there's a concentration forming, right? They don't look at it because they look at, hey, say I offer 20 services in manufacturing. One's repairing ball bearings, manufacturing small parts, one's redoing engines. Well, I didn't realize Exxon was buying all these different services and dividing it out. I didn't think Exxon bought a lot of ball bearings, but I didn't realize, man, Exxon made up 20% of my sales in this category, or they make up 90% in this one category I offer. I just didn't realize that. I just paid invoice number 2044 and sent it out, not realizing that was Exxon sometimes or a subsidiary of Exxon. QV is also a good way to identify those issues too and help mitigate and make sure it's being properly accounted for because you as a buyer and a seller, you both need to know that. That's why it's good for a seller sometimes to do a Q of E, like we've talked about, Chris, early on.
Mhm.
Make sure all that's lined up and accounted for, because then you can present the buyer and say, here's my Q of E. Look how detailed this is. Look how well I've got this organized. You know everything that I know, and it's been accounted for and reconciled by a third party. this is as good as it gets. What's your risk tolerance?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, the strongest businesses aren't the ones with the biggest customers. They are the ones that can thrive without customers, without that customer.
That's
Yeah.
correct.
Not all customers, but that one customer. The earlier as a
Yes.
business owner that you identify and reduce all your concentrations that we're talking about today,
Mm-hmm.
the easier it's going to be to sell your company when it becomes time. And so what I would tell you is if you're thinking about selling, to start talk to a broker, talk to your CPA, maybe run a quick dependency check. How dependent are you on a
Mm-hmm.
customer or a vendor or an employee?
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're years from selling, the work you do today is going to give buyers confidence to pay top dollar for the value that you're looking for.
No, you're not wrong. You can't control what the rest of the world does sometimes. You can't control what big companies get bought and sold and moved around. You can't control the workflow sometimes. There are parts of business that are out of our control, lending, etc. If you're reliant on that customer and you just keep going about doing it, you're waiting. The odds every day increase something else can go wrong, right? Statistically, if you just keep waiting, it will eventually happen. It's like speeding. You can speed for 40 years and never get caught. But the odds of you getting caught now are higher than they were 20 years because you've done it every single day and compounded that chance of it happening to you in the future. The same logic applies to customer concentrations, knowledge concentrations, vendor concentrations. It's waiting for the day to occur, right? It's waiting for that day to happen to you. You need to be prepared for that. And with AI coming, also is going to be faster. It's going to be easier. And in some cases, more accurate. So understand that. I mean, I have a family member who has a private equity group in another state. They get, let's say, 60 sims a week. They're using AI now to skim those sims. And part of their, cross off the list, if it mentions customer concentration over X number, they throw that sim out. Like the AI does it for them. And they're not even sorting through it. The AI is just ripping it out. Think about that. So if you've got customer concentration issues, work on them. Granted, it may be scary. Well, it's going to get thrown out regardless. But if you highlight certain parts, I guarantee AI will focus on that and say, hey, yes, they said a customer concentration issue, but there's already a fix in place. They'll pick that up. Now, I'm making a little bit of assumption there, but that's what was relayed to me and described as we're working to help it not only identify the words, but then read the subtext under it and paste those differently than just X number, toss it out. That being said, if it's 50%, they may just toss it out regardless. But if it's 20, it at least helps it identify and not get thrown out. Just like AI goes through job applications, right, Chris? You don't have an MBA? Toss. Don't have a disqualification? Toss. Those days are coming. Don't get caught with your pants down not being prepared.
Excellent point.
Absolutely. Always excellent points here, Christopher. What are you talking about? Always great.
Well, sometimes I throw out some bombs.
We all do. We all have our days. We all have our moments. If you took anything away from today listening, I'll finish on this note. Concentrations aren't a deal killer. They're not a death sentence. Don't be afraid of them. Look at them as part of the business you've yet to optimize, that you can optimize and create value. Sometimes you get to create value by generating revenue, right, Chris? Capital expenditure, adding working capital.
For sure.
These are ways to add optimization without necessarily spending a whole bunch of money or spending a whole bunch of time and just looking at it going, I could do a little bit better. Let me just work on this a little bit, especially knowledge base. You've got the time and the knowledge. You just got to find a way to transfer it down. If you've got a customer concentration, start looking around, like you said, just start testing the waters or for vendors. See what's out there. And if you don't like it or it's not better, annotate what you found to give a buyer to say, hey, I've addressed these issues. Here's what I found. So before you go out there and say, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that, Mr. Seller? I have done it. I've proven what's out there. Here's what you need to know for your game plan taking over and going forward. You want to give the buyer a vote of confidence, showing that you've done your market research. You've done your planning. You've worked around these issues. That's going to make them feel better knowing what they're buying. That's not some great unknown that it can't be done or won't be done or hasn't been attempted. Here it is. Run with it. Or if there is opportunity, here it all is too. Go however good, just go at it.
Right.
The sky's the limit for you.
Exactly.
Transferability, folks. Transferability. Burn it into your brain if you're listening. I think we covered it all today, huh? Did I miss anything?
I think we got it.
I think we did. Well, I think next week, Chris, we should talk about a topic that I think you and I would enjoy speaking on, especially me. And this is a very fun topic that I want to, and let's tease everybody. Let's talk about how to identify good listings for buyers out there when you're searching, how to look at what's out there being advertised, how to understand what it is, and what you should and should not inquire on based on your criteria. I think we've talked a lot about how to look at a business once you've gotten past the NDA stage. Let's talk about identifying it when you just start looking out there. If you're a buyer and as a seller, why it matters to you, how your listing should be, how your business should be presented, and how to avoid the red flags, the mistakes, in our opinion, like no asking price. We teased that earlier, but we're going to bring it up again. Let's cover that. I think that'd be an excellent episode for all y'all listening. What do you think, Chris?
Sounds like a good one. Lots of good information.
Well, all right. Well, let's stay tuned next week for that episode. I think a lot of you out there are really going to like that, especially for those of you trying to sift through all the noise of what's out there to acquire and the guru's promising you all the streamlined deals. We'll address that too, I promise. But for this episode, I am Brandon Bourgeois. That is my co-host, Christopher Sater. We appreciate you listening. As always, you can call, email, send us messages, what you want to hear us talk about, what you like more, like, don't like. We love your input. We thank you for listening to the Steps to Soul podcast, and we will see you next week. Y'all have a good one.